There was absolutely nothing about him.
He got up from his seat where he'd been working, took out his knife.
Just trying to kill him.
Called it in as a homicide.
You go through the ifs and the maybes, and it doesn't help.
The following stories tell the tale of some of the worst teenagers in human history. When an adult commits a crime, you might ask yourself, what were the circumstances that hardened this person? What happened to them in the past? What's the reason behind this terrible murder? And if no reason is apparent, then you can just say, well, perhaps they're just psychopaths. But when a child is a psychopathic killer, it is so much harder to fathom. How can a 15-year-old boy simply get up, grab his knife, and stab a beloved teacher in front of all her students? How can a 13-year-old stab someone 62 times? And then calmly leave through the front door? How can an 18-year-old go on a planned killing spree? We might not like to think about it, but tragically there are teenagers who think this way among us. Sometimes they have been the victim of terrible circumstances. Sometimes they're simply bad seeds that shock everyone around them. In today's cases, I'll let you decide. This story begins in Leeds, a pretty large city in the northern UK. It's a lively city with a famous soccer team and a reputable academic world. Indeed, Leeds values its teachers. But it's not just its university teachers. 61-year-old Ann Maguire was a beloved Spanish teacher at a local high school, Corpus Christi School. She was devoted at school as she was at home. She had been married to her husband Don for 37 years, and they had 2 grown-up daughters, one of which is the Royal Ballet soloist Emma Maguire. Anne had also adopted 2 more children from her late sister.
But she also adopted her sister's 2 sons, I think back in the 1980s, when unfortunately her sister died.
People knew and loved Anne for her never-ending care and kindness towards others. She always put others before her, which you might agree is a great quality for a teacher to have. Many of her students appreciated this in her. She had taught at Corpus Christi for 4 long decades, and she was one of the most popular figures there.
What makes this as tragic a story as you can imagine is that Ann Maguire wasn't just a teacher, she was a stalwart of a whole school community.
But as you might have already guessed, not everyone liked Anne. There was one kid who was harboring a huge amount of anger, and in 2014, all his anger was directed towards his Spanish teacher. Will Cornick was born on June 26, 1998. He grew up with his parents, an older brother, and a younger stepbrother. But his family wasn't a very stable one. When he was 6, his parents split up. However, there wasn't any violence or verbal aggression between them.
Will had been brought up in the Leeds area by a family that were a very close family, very loving family, and a very supportive family. There had been a divorce, the parents lived separately, but they were both very responsible people.
Will's parents described him as calm, contained, and a warm child who had great relationships with both his brothers. At school, he had great marks and a 100% attendance rate.
A young person who was bright, intellectually able, and in fact had undertaken GCSEs a year earlier than otherwise he would have done.
In 2013, Anne herself had written in Will's report that he was a bright and conscientious student. There were never any signs that Will would go on to become the first pupil to murder his teacher in the classroom in the UK. There weren't even red flags concerning his aggression. Nothing. Will had a bunch of friends at school, and none of them suspected what was going on in his mind at the time.
I was in the same English and maths as Will. He seemed normal. He wasn't my type of person. We had different tastes for things, but he just seemed like another normal kid in my class.
Will had a tendency to not speak his feelings. But then, don't most teenage boys have this? Sure, he never spoke much, but that didn't mean anything to anyone around him. After all, being an introvert is not a red flag, and it is surely not a crime.
Normally, as a psychologist, when looking at children who murder or commit serious violence, I would expect to see telltale signs. Things such as an unstable environment.
There was absolutely nothing about him that would say to you there is someone who is dangerous.
Will Cornick did have a mental breakdown in 2013 when he was diagnosed with diabetes. He was deeply affected by this. It meant he wouldn't be able to join the army. It had been his lifelong career dream, and now he had to rethink everything. Apparently, he even began self-harming as a reaction to the bad news. But soon enough, he started taking out his hatred on his teachers, especially on Ann Maguire, who he disliked from the get-go.
Will always said that he didn't like Miss Maguire, but we always thought it was just the normal dislike for a teacher. There was teachers that I didn't like, teachers that other pupils didn't like, but would have never dreamed of doing anything like what Will did.
The first concerning moment was in November 2013 at a parents' evening at the school. Will refused to see Ann Maguire that night. She'd taught him Spanish since 2009. Now, he kept saying he couldn't be bothered to talk to her. Then on Christmas that year, Will texted one of his friends on Facebook saying he wanted to brutally kill Ann. Ann didn't know this, but she had a bad feeling about her student. In February 2014, she actually sent Will to detention for refusing to do his homework.
There had been a difficult interaction between Will and Ann Maguire in the February, and this seemed to have arisen because he didn't do any homework and then was placed on detention.
This meant that Will was unable to go on a school bowling trip. He felt humiliated, and his rage was building up like never before. This was what he wrote to a friend on Facebook. The one absolute bitch that deserves more than death, more than pain, torture, and more than anything that we can understand. So Will went on the school trip anyway, ignoring Ann's clear instruction.
That was almost like public humiliation for him. That, how dare she? How dare she tell me not to go? Which he showed that that's what he was feeling, because he then turned up and went on the trip anyway.
Cornick had lost his moral compass. He didn't care about doing the right thing anymore. By now, this was a game of chess for him. For every move Ann made, he had a more aggressive move against her. His defiance only predicted his horrific deed.
That led to further repercussions and, in fact, what they called an internal exclusion, which meant he had to work on his own in class for a day because of that.
This was a dark, vicious circle that would end in murder. Ann Maguire was his enemy, and he needed to come out on top.
William Cornick controlled this offence from start to finish. At least over the weekend before, he'd appeared to be entirely normal with his family, did normal things, was laughing and joking, interacting, but all the time he was planning what was to occur on the Monday morning.
On Monday morning, April 28, 2014, Ann was helping 2 classes revise Spanish for their GCSE exams. That's when Will Cornick came into the classroom and stabbed her to death.
During the Spanish lesson, he got up from his seat where he'd been working, took out his knife.
Cornick had a big kitchen knife hidden in his backpack. He took it out, hid it in his sleeve, and walked over to the classroom where Ann was teaching. Right then, Ann was bent over a desk helping one of her students with her classwork. Cornick used so much sheer force that he cut Ann's jugular vein as she was running into the hallway to save her life. All of this was happening in front of a class full of students.
Savagery of this attack and the calmness on the build-up to stabbing Ann Maguire shows his hatred for his teacher. He was totally calm, and he wanted to enact the most severe pain he could on Ann Maguire. This shows that this was a personal attack. He wanted to cause pain, and nothing was going to stop him.
Ann ran into the hallway screaming for help at the top of her lungs. A colleague rushed to her aid and pushed her into a room. She then blocked the entrance to the room so that Cornick wouldn't be able to barge in. He did try to, pushing the door several times, like in the worst horror movies. The 2 women sat on the floor, curled up and scared for their lives. When he realized he couldn't enter the room, Will calmly returned to his classroom and pulled a Jack Daniels bottle out of his backpack. He wanted to celebrate killing his teacher. But within minutes, another teacher came into the room, grabbed Cornick, and took him downstairs to the reception, where the police arrested him. Meanwhile, Ann was taken to a hospital and given emergency treatment, but a few hours later, she was pronounced dead.
Ann Maguire, who was given emergency treatment, taken to hospital, but unfortunately I don't think there was very much they could do. The injuries were absolutely terrible. I think the first paramedic on the scene said that they were some of the worst stab injuries they had ever seen.
The news spread quickly throughout the school as everyone was in utter shock over what they had just seen. Why had Will Cornick done this? No one saw this coming, and everything seemed surreal. After his arrest, Cornick admitted to psychiatrists that he had been planning the murder 4 days prior to April 28th. Apparently, Cornick had also put out a Facebook message to see if any of his friends would murder Ann for him for £10. A sick joke, people thought. But should Will's colleagues have seen this coming? A weekend before the murder, Will sent very clear signs to his schoolmates that he would kill his teacher. In fact, he even bragged about wanting to kill 2 more teachers, one of which was a pregnant woman. Still, no one took him seriously.
The morning that it happened, I asked Will if he wanted to play cards, and he said no. And I said, oh, should we play cards tomorrow then? And Will said, oh, I won't be here tomorrow. And I just thought he was going to pull a sickie from school or just not come in and skive.
On that Monday morning, Will went to his mother's house, took her best knives and a whiskey bottle, and went to school. He was completely honest about his intentions and even bragged about what he was planning to do. He even showed his classmates his knives, but again, no one believed him.
This isn't something that he had been stewing with himself and plotting internally. He actually made this known to people.
After murdering Ann in front of all his classmates and chasing her into the hallway, Cornick returned to the classroom and pulled out the whiskey bottle from his backpack to celebrate his deed.
He then returned to where he'd been sat originally and said to the class, so that they could all hear, good times.
When he was arrested, Will just went over with the cops with a calm poker face. He showed zero remorse or any signs of distress.
I think he asked the first police officer to arrive what their favourite movie was. He was acting in an astonishingly relaxed way.
There's an element of calmness that's chilling about this case.
In fact, Cornick has shown no remorse to this day. He is completely emotionally disconnected from his horrific actions.
I also asked him how the children who'd witnessed this offence must be feeling and how the family of Ann Maguire must be feeling. And generally he made some very derogatory comments saying things like, I couldn't give a shit.
Needless to say, the murder left the school and its community in shambles. People were confused, outraged, and scared. What if there were other psycho killers hiding in plain sight?
The effect on the school and community is kind of obvious in some ways. I mean, the shock's incredible. No school in Britain's really had to cope with anything like that before.
Will Cornick was sentenced to life in prison with a minimum of 20 years before parole. Meanwhile, the school and the Leeds community worked hard to make a proper memorial for a woman who dedicated her whole adult life to the Corpus Christi school.
In the days after, the school said that they were staying open and the pupils were welcome to come and grieve together. The head teacher did an amazing job of looking after us all. Everyone was writing out like prayers on pieces of paper for Miss Maguire and hanging them on the trees in the chapel and things like that.
In 2017, Ann's family opened an inquiry as to why none of the students alerted the teachers about Cornick's plans. After all, he had bragged about it to many people. Detective Superintendent Nick Wallen, who led the investigation, stressed that it is not on any of the students' shoulders that they didn't believe Cornick at that time. It would be wholly wrong to sit here and raise that perhaps all this could have been avoided if a 15-year-old boy had told the teacher. Indeed, it's sad that no one took Cornick seriously, but the horrific murder is not his classmates' responsibility. Will Cornick is a psychopathic killer who still shows zero remorse for his actions. His stance on it is perhaps one of the most disturbing out there.
He said, I know the victim's family will be upset, but I don't care. In my eyes, everything I've done is fine and dandy.
These haunting words are the worst possible news for Ann's family and everyone who is hurting after her loss. Instead of getting an apology and receiving some closure, they will forever know that Cornick feels proud of what he did that Monday morning. Our next story happens in Warwick, Rhode Island in the 1980s. Craig Chandler Price was born on October 11, 1973, and was raised by his parents, Shirley and John. As far as records show, he had a loving, supportive family, and for the first decade of his life, he was showing it. He was a happy, energetic boy who would always offer to help his neighbors with daily tasks. He was also into athletics and music at school and seemed to get nothing but good grades. But things took a turn for the worse pretty early on. As soon as he was 10, Craig started getting very dark thoughts about the world around him. Soon, these thoughts were turned outward, and he started getting into trouble with the authorities. By the age of 13, he was arrested for breaking and entering, robbery, stalking, illegal substance use, and assault. Most of these offenses were reported by his own family. By now, Craig was turning violent toward them too. He was a huge boy with violent tendencies that no one knew how to control anymore. On July 27, 1987, Craig snuck out of his home at night. But he wasn't just going to snoop around people's homes. He was intent to cause harm. He chose a 3-bedroom house just a few feet away from his own. Inside was 27-year-old Rebecca, or Becky Spencer. She was recently divorced, a mom of 2, who was about to move out of that house as her lease had just expired. That morning, her ex-husband had picked up their 2 children to help Becky pack and move out. Becky packed with her brother and a friend for the whole day. In the evening, they left, and she fell asleep in the living room watching TV. That's when Craig Price entered her home. She didn't wake up at first, so Craig headed straight to the kitchen.
And then I was like, oh, what the hell? I ran into the kitchen. On top of the refrigerator was a knife. And I just killed her.
He didn't just kill her. He stabbed her 58 times with almost superhuman force, puncturing several organs in the process. He left her in a pool of blood and left the house out the front door, as if nothing had happened. Becky's brother found the horrific scene the next morning and called 911 immediately, but the police couldn't retrieve the lethal weapon or any fingerprints leading to the killer. The suspect pool was too large to narrow it all down to a few suspects. Craig was a 13-year-old boy living in the same neighborhood, and he did have a criminal record, but a petty one. No one would suspect a 13-year-old boy of such a heinous act. 2 years passed, and Becky's case had gone cold. Craig was now a high school student living his life, just like all the kids around him. But he wasn't done with being a monster. He'd enjoyed that killing, and it was clear the police weren't getting any closer to catching him. This gave him the incentive to kill again. If he had a taste for blood and he couldn't get caught, why not do it again? So one evening, Craig set his eyes on another woman in his neighborhood, Joan Heaton. Joan was also a mother of 2, but she was also a widow. Her husband had tragically taken his own life a few years into their marriage, and Joan had taken her daughters Jennifer and Melissa to a new town to start a new life. Tragically, this town was Warwick, and her new home address was down the street from Craig Price. On September 1st, 1989, he snuck into Joan's home and into the kitchen. He grabbed a large steak knife that Joan had just bought that day. But the sound woke Joan up, and she came downstairs to check what was making the noise.
Things just got hectic after that. What did she say to you when she saw you, Craig? She didn't say anything. She was just trying to, as soon as she seen you, run the other way, break the other way.
So Craig grabbed Joan and pinned her down.
So I was just trying to kill her.
Meanwhile, Joan's 2 daughters were woken up by the horrible screams. Before dying, Joan urged Melissa to go to the phone and dial 911. But her daughters just stood there, frozen, as they watched their mother being stabbed 57 times.
Do you remember, how many knives did you use? I don't know, a lot. About 6, I think, maybe.
No matter how much Joan fought back, Craig was much bigger and much angrier. Joan soon succumbed to her horrific wounds. Then, Craig stabbed Jennifer 62 times. When Melissa finally got to the phone, Craig stabbed her 37 times, then crushed her head with a chair. When he was done, he decided to cover all 3 bodies with blankets and rugs.
Covered the mother. Do you remember what you covered the other children with? The rug. The rug. Okay. All right. Why did you call him? Because I didn't want to look at that.
He'd just brutally murdered a whole family, but he didn't like the sight of it. The next day, police were called to Joan's home after her family had seen the horrific sight through her window. The first responders said, underneath the blanket were these 3 bodies that were absolutely destroyed. It was a truly ugly scene that everyone wished they hadn't seen. As the police were trying to figure out who might have done this terrible thing, the Warwick community was growing fearful. They now had a name for Craig, the Warwick Slasher. People were starting to stay indoors and double-check every door and window at night. If he had killed 4 people, 2 children included, anyone could be next. Warwick police were confident they were looking for a serial killer. Both his victims were single moms, and they had all been stabbed in a similar manner several times, with kitchen knives. Soon enough, the investigation had 2 big clues. 1, the attacker's footprint had been found inside Joan's home, and it was a size 13. 2, an FBI profiler determined that whoever had knifed Melissa had cut himself in the process. The tip of the blade had broken off inside his victim, and in a fit of rage, the profiler was certain Craig would have hurt himself. The police were now looking for a man wearing size 13 shoes and a bandage on his hand. Days after the murder, officers spotted Craig at a local park. He seemed to fit both descriptions, so the officers asked him how he'd hurt his hand. He said he punched a car window, but a quick investigation of this proved he was lying. There had been no car vandalization over the past week. Craig was lying. Around the time, one of Craig's friends called the police to report something strange. Craig had been bragging about killing Becky and not getting caught for 2 years. Now the police could get a search warrant for his home, and inside was a plastic bin full of bloody clothes and knives. The forensics team soon connected the blood to the most recent crime scene. By the end of the day, Craig was arrested from his family home in front of his shocked parents. In the interrogation room, Craig was pressed by the detectives to give a reason for his horrific murders. He said it all started when a man called him the N-word. He followed him home, and it turns out he was Becky's brother. Then when he entered Becky's home, it was just her, and he just killed her. Then he got a taste for blood. Craig was charged with 4 counts of first-degree murder and 2 counts of burglary. He was still 15 years old, so he could only be in prison until his 21st birthday. Needless to say, this triggered widespread panic. How is this justice for all the victims? No one would have felt safe in Warwick knowing Craig Price was free. Luckily, Craig behaved so badly throughout his time in prison that he's still there. First, he refused to go through psychological testing and therapy, so he was charged with contempt of court. During this trial, he screamed at a correctional officer saying, "I'm going to kill every officer I can get my hands on, just like I killed those little girls." He was thus given 15 more years in prison. In 1996, he got another year added after biting the finger off a guard. He was then given another 25 years with 15 suspended for continuing to refuse treatment. Then, in 2017, he viciously attacked another inmate with a knife. If that hadn't happened, he could have walked free by 2019.
Is scheduled to go to trial next month in Florida for allegedly attempting to murder a fellow inmate with a homemade knife. But if he's acquitted, it will be up to Rhode Island prosecutors to get him held as a probation violator, or the 45-year-old could be a free man late next year.
Craig Price was sentenced to another 25 years behind bars for attempted murder. It doesn't seem like there will be any freedom for him, but this brings little justice to the women and children he once took from this world. Our last story takes us to Allentown, a city full of history in eastern Pennsylvania. On August 5th, 1992, just before midnight, 29-year-old Joan Bughart was returning home from her night shift as a nurse. When she stepped into her home, although it was quiet, she felt someone was there, or had been there, minutes before. Then she saw her fan was off.
Fan that she had left running was turned off, and there was approximately $40 to $50 taken from her apartment.
Needless to say, Joan told the police about it, but they couldn't find any clues inside her home.
No usable evidence was obtained at that time.
Joan was terrified at the thought of living alone in a home that had been broken into, but she had no choice. 4 days later, her neighbor called 911. There was very loud music being played from her apartment, but she couldn't get through to Joan to turn it down.
The officer on the scene gained entry into the apartment. There was blood everywhere. He located the victim and called it in as a homicide.
Joan's place was quite literally a bloodbath. She had been violated and bludgeoned 37 times. This was someone who had a lot of anger in them.
It basically is somebody who is in a frenzy.
Chief Detective Sullivan and his team couldn't find any fingerprints at the scene, but they recovered semen from a pair of pants that had been discarded there. While they sent this to the lab for profiling, they started looking at the suspect pool. Did Joan have any partners or ex-partners that looked suspicious?
She had an ex-boyfriend who was actually a patient at the state hospital, which was built for patients with some mental issues.
Detective Sullivan interviewed this man inside the psychiatric hospital and found he had an alibi. He had been in the hospital on the night of Joan's murder and had no injuries on his arms. The police then started looking at other burglaries in the area. Nothing came up. The same happened when the results came back from the lab. There was no DNA match. The case grew cold, but no one truly forgot the heinous crime. The people in the neighborhood were forever on guard, and the detectives knew this wasn't the end of it. In June 1993, 15-year-old Charlotte Schmoyer was delivering newspapers in her neighborhood just before sunrise. She thought she saw someone lurking in the shadows. Just as she was urging them to stop the silly prank, she was murdered. The next morning, someone called the police about a newspaper cart that was still filled with papers.
A concerned neighbor called in, said she's not sure why it's there, and was curious as to the whereabouts of the paper girl.
The police knew this was a serious incident. Within minutes, a large police unit arrived at the scene and searched the surroundings. They found Charlotte's body under a large stack of trees. She had been violated and stabbed. Once again, a brutal overkill. Officers as well as residents put two and two together. This was a manic serial killer.
People became more cautious with their kids, more cautious with where they were going and what they were doing.
The Allentown police took this seriously. They went door to door, interviewed anyone they thought that could help in the investigation, and pursued any leads that they could think of. But it was like chasing a ghost. Then something terrible happened again. On June 28th, 3 weeks after Charlotte's murder, a man from the neighborhood, John Kelly, left home for the night, leaving his wife, Denise, at home.
Should I have stayed home that night? You know, you go through the ifs and the maybes, and it doesn't help.
When John got back home at around 2:30 a.m., police cars surrounded his house. His wife had been the victim of a horrendous attack, but she was in the hospital.
Well, it was gut-wrenching, I can say that. That overwhelming fear. I think as a woman, we all think, well, what will we do? Will we be able to run? Will we be able to scream? Will we fight? Do we fight? Should we fight?
In a surge of adrenaline, Denise was able to knock the knife out of the attacker's hand and run out of the house and down the street. He chased after her and pinned her down, punching her repeatedly. Then, she bit him as hard as she could. Then, he took his belt off.
So I don't know if he's raping me and strangling me at the same time that my body is convulsing. He never says anything, never speaks a word. I'm dying. I see the light.
It was at the last minute that a neighbor turned on their lights and scared the killer off. Barely recovering from the shock, Denise gave the police a description of the monster, but the killer knew he could now be identified. So, only 2 weeks after Denise returned home, he broke in again. Except this time, a security system went off, and John was by Denise's side, equipped with a gun. He ran as soon as he heard the alarm, and the police were notified about the burglary. Detective Sullivan had another detective stay at Denise's home every night for 2 weeks in case the attacker reappeared. They even left 2 windows open as a lure.
This was essentially putting me in harm's way, and we all knew that. My wife knew that. I was only married for like 3 months at this time, so it's a little stressful.
But as the days passed, it seemed like the killer wasn't returning. But at 1 a.m. on July 31st, Detective Lewis heard a noise. Then he saw the window open, and a gloved hand reached in. The attacker couldn't see the detective, so he walked toward him in the living room. That's when Lewis turned his flashlight on and told the attacker to freeze. But he pulled a gun, and a nasty shootout started. Once Lewis was out of ammo, the attacker fled through the kitchen window. This was devastating to everyone involved. Would this horrible man ever get caught? The police called all hospitals, putting them on guard for anyone wanting treatment for gunshot wounds. 2 hours later, he appeared, having been shot in the stomach. Harvey Miguel Robinson was 18 years old at the time of his arrest. He went to high school, lived with his mom, and had a girlfriend.
There was nothing remarkable about him. A serial killer looks like anybody. It's not the big boogeyman anymore. It's the person next door, the person down the street. They have two different personalities. They have a normal life, and then they have this hidden life.
The only clue police could find out of Robinson's past was that he had an abusive father. He had beaten his mother numerous times, and later on, he beat his mistress to death. He was in prison, but he had left a big mark on his son. Robinson became a sociopathic killer with only one goal: to destroy the lives of innocent women. When he was arrested and interrogated, he didn't speak a word, but the police had all the evidence they needed. His DNA matched those at all crime scenes. When he was sentenced to death, he didn't even flinch. He showed zero emotion. Robinson remains on death row to this day, but all of those affected by his heinous acts remain shocked and confused. How could a teenager commit such brutal acts? How does a child become a monster? There may never be peace for the victims' families. Thanks for watching, you guys. Hey, don't be shy. Give this video a thumbs up and subscribe for more. You stay safe, and I'll see you next time.